We're now going to keep moving the show forward, and we're very happy to have David Hundeyin with us, the Nigerian investigative journalist and author, to talk about the ongoing, just, I don't even know what to call it, ridiculous attempts by the U.S. government to censor what people are watching in Africa and around the world. David, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I guess my first question for you here is, it seems like so much of this they've banned Africa Stream, RT, and they claim that Africa Stream and is somehow Russian and connected to RT secretly through intelligence links or whatever. But we can get into that. But I think to me, the maybe underlying issue here of what the U.S. government has done in trying to restrict the operations of various Russian media and various independent media like Africa Stream is the assumption that somehow Africans in particular cannot think for themselves, and that the positions and feelings that people have all around the continent on whatever the issue may be, the war in Ukraine or the role of Russia and China in the world or whatever, is only happening because they're being secretly manipulated, which just seems massively paternalistic to me. But I wonder your thoughts on that question, David.
So I have two thoughts on that. The first is I find that entire concept to be, in addition to being disgustingly racist, I find it incredibly offensive. Personally, I take it very personal because I work with African Stream. I know the amount of effort that we put into what we actually put out. I know the amount of fact checking we do. I know the amount of technical accomplishment it takes to actually put out a piece of content, right? Because we have a thing in our newsroom that if you wouldn't want to watch it, then you shouldn't put it out there. Right. We put a lot of effort into what we do. And then to hear the US, I believe the number 5, was it number 6 citizen of the US, coming on air to call us by name and basically reduce all of our hard work to Russian. He didn't even say they're funded by Russia or funded by RT. He said they're secretly run by RT, with the inference being that these guys are too stupid to even put out any of this stuff, to create any of this stuff on their own. It can only be the Russians. And there's a very long history of this sort of it's much more than just paternalistic thinking. There's a very long history of this incredibly boneheaded sort of thinking in the US. I personally trace it back as far back as the 19th century, where this fictitious ailment called drapetomania was invented. With the claim that any African wanting to be free was suffering from a mental illness, because as we well know, Africans have no human desire to be free. The natural position of an African is supposedly slavery. This happened again in 1930. This was at the peak of the Jim Crow era, at a time where Africans, both in the diaspora and on the continent, where I believe in the US the term was 3/5 of the human being. In Africa, we weren't even classified as humans. In some parts of the continent, like in Southern Africa, Africans were classified as flora and fauna. And in a place like Nigeria, where I come from, Nigeria wasn't even classified as a country under occupation. It was classified as a corporate object owned by the Queen. We're ruled by something called the Royal Niger Trading Company. And in the midst of all that, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic started uniting to come up with some sort of Pan-Africanist thinking. And the US government said it's the Soviets that are behind it. In the 1960s, during the African independence era, which coincided with the civil rights movement, because they were both joined at the hip, it was the same thing. Martin Luther King is a Russian agent. Kwame Nkrumah is a Russian agent. Patrice Lumumba, Fred Hampton, you guys are all Russian agents. In 1985, the apartheid head of Prime Minister of South Africa claimed that blacks are happy in South Africa under apartheid. And the only blacks who aren't happy are those who have had Russian ideas pushed into their heads. So it's like we're in 2024 and this same thing is being rinsed again, that without the involvement of this Russian subversive funding or indoctrination, or whatever, these group of people, black people, are just too fundamentally stupid to have any positions, any ideologies, any voices, any thoughts of their own. They can only do something when there's the hand of Vladimir puppeting them.
It's really incredible. It's so paternalistic and, like you said, racist. I also thought it was interesting in this New York Times article announcing after Antony Blinken's speech that they would be putting these sanctions, these new sanctions on like basically RT, classifying it as Russian intelligence. And this speaks to the broader issue of just trying to muzzle any media that isn't U.S. controlled. I'm going to quote from the New York Times. They said, "The goal of the sanctions and diplomacy is to alert countries where RT remains a popular source of global news, including in many parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South America, to the potential for Russian influence campaigns against governments that fall out of the Kremlin's favor." So, of course, on top of accusing this or that outlet that's popular, that's saying, that's pushing out anti-imperialist ideas, is all Russian-backed, there is this also clear fear of any kind of media that isn't giving a U.S. government perspective on things. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that, because as we see these geopolitical shifts around the world, you do see a lot of people in global South countries really changing their views of the U.S. based on the U.S.'s own behavior, not because Russia's telling them to.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the classic behavior of a dying empire, if you like. When a star is in the process of turning into a supernova, is at its most dangerous, and is at its most irrational. That's what the U.S. is doing. We've seen this in so many ways, not just in Africa, but it seems like it's a recurring motif in pretty much everything the U.S. does with its foreign policy now, where in trying to accomplish one goal, which is to hobble the other guy, it ends up indirectly strengthening the other guy. So, for example, when it tried to, I believe the Secretary of Trade, Janet Yellen, said in her own words that the goal was to hobble China, to stop China from accessing the ability to manufacture a certain type of chip. Guess what? China simply went ahead and found a way. And now, based on the crazy stunts that this great ally of the US that shall remain unnamed pulled yesterday, half of the world is going to be pivoting toward Chinese chips and Chinese electronics, right? So they've essentially sanctioned their own companies. They did the same thing with the sanctions on Russia. They effectively sanctioned Russia. They sanctioned Western suppliers because now they don't have access to Russia's markets. Russia simply pivoted toward China and other suppliers. So Russian consumers and the Russian economy is not suffering, but Western interests are suffering. So effectively, they've sort of self-sanctioned, and they're doing the exact same thing in Africa all over again, where instead of trying to show that, okay, if we claim that what narratives being put out by the likes of African Stream are wrong, they're not accurate, that the US is actually a force for good in Africa, this is the evidence, this is what we're doing. Instead of trying to do that, it's, oh, let's ban them. Let's stop people from having access to them. And they don't seem to realize that by doing that, they're just proving our point even further. Because what business it would have been different if Blinken had said we are restricting access to African Stream in the US. US citizens shouldn't see it. That's fine. That's America's prerogative to determine what Americans get to see, right? Because Americans have electoral control over who gets to decide those things for them. But then you are standing in DC and making decisions effectively on behalf of an entire continent. So you are telling a platform like Meta, which has billions of users across the world, to deplatform a news organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. Right. So millions of people, literally millions of people across the continent and across the world who follow African Stream have essentially had that taken away from them by some sort of imperial diktat from Washington. And that only proves the point that we have constantly tried to make, that the US is an empire. It behaves like an empire. These are the actions of an imperialist, and they just can't seem to stop themselves.
One of the things I'm curious your thoughts about in just terms of, the why this moment and why now. I mean, do you feel that they're worried, the United States, that is, that they're losing control of Africa? I mean, I think one thing about Africa Stream is it's, produced by younger Africans. It's very on the pulse of younger Africans, the movements that are happening all across the continent, the questions that people are talking about. I mean, do you think there's an element of fear here, not just of what people may do if they are able to access news sources like Africa Stream, Stream and others, but what they're already doing and the fact that Africans and younger Africans are producing their own media to reflect their own experiences, which are obviously, it seems to me at least, moving in a different direction than where America and Europe might like.
I believe that's exactly the problem. What they've been used to is being able to operate almost sort of unopposed in Africa, because for the longest time, the biggest problem Africa faced was there was a huge asymmetry in global information. So, as you may or may not know, the entire, pretty much something like 90 something percent of Africa's digital satellite television market, for example, is dominated by a single company. It used to be South African. It's now owned by Canal Plus, which is a French company. So essentially, an entire continent's digital television is now owned by some guy in Paris, right? And it used to be owned by some white guy in Joburg, right? So there used to be this sort of very tight control over what information gets into the heads of Africans. So in 2022, for example, when the decision was made to sanction RT, stop RT from broadcasting in Europe and the US, RT, as you may or may not know, was also stopped from broadcasting across Africa, even though Africa had no business with any of that. Africa was not involved in the sanctions package on the Russians, but because the RT feed that fed MultiChoice, which is the sort of monopoly entity on the African continent, came from a European supplier, and the European supplier had to follow EU sanctions, that happened, basically. So effectively, you've had one guy in Washington switching, turning switches on and off for 2 billion people or so, which absolutely should not be the case. But now, because of the rise of the internet and social media and the use of social media by platforms like African Stream, which, as you know, even though it has a native website, it focuses almost exclusively on social media platforms, right? Which is why it's so influential. We've been able to leverage that and get this message out to people. And for the first time, people are seeing that this is not just like some airy fairy ivory tower narrative that some Cornel West type person says on CNN, that I can actually connect to this. I can see why my economy is depressed. I can see why I don't have jobs in my economy. I can see why, despite so and so $1 billion of aid that supposedly is coming into my country, I can see why I don't see any evidence of it. I can see why some US ambassador will claim that they're investing $10 billion into the railway corridor in my country, and there are no jobs coming out of it. I can see why now, because there's this platform that is showing me that this is what has been done elsewhere, and this is what is being done here, and that's the difference. And for the first time, I can connect with it and make that connection, and then that turns into political action, which apparently is not what the US government wants to see. But I don't know what to tell them, because unfortunately for them, unfortunately from their point of view, the truth is this is the world's youngest population. So a country like Angola, for example, the median age is 16.5. Nigeria, the median age is 18.9. Right? Statistically, more than 40% of Africans are teenagers. This is the world's youngest continent. So when you have that kind of young population that now has, relatively cheap, widespread, high-speed internet access, it can only ever be a matter of time until that information equalization takes place, and then you'll start to see real political movements toward the outcome that you don't want. So it's either you're going to drop a nuke on the whole continent, or you're going to have to deal with the reality that the paradigm is shifting, and these people are not going to be your cannon fodder and the sort of like, as I describe it, organic traffic cones next to the mines and the oil wells that you have in your imagination. So good luck to them.
Winds of change are blowing. Well, as always, we appreciate you joining us here on the show. David Hundeyin, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.